Theodore Jonathan Kaczynski, a name that the country would not know formally, but would be all too familiar with, as he was known as the Unabomber, conducting seemingly politically fueled attacks of domestic terrorism over the course of 17 years. Building fear over what for so long people believed were senseless murders happening for no reason, and behind a motive that still has parts that are unclear today. The childhood usually provides the greatest context. Perhaps if we highlight the issues within little Edward's life, perhaps we can isolate a key trauma or moment that can build a reasonable link to his violent splurge. Now, the story of the Unabomber starts when he was born a junior to his father, who was also named Ted, of Polish descent in Chicago, Illinois. This would be May 22nd, 1942, during the Second World War. Now, this would also make Ted a Gemini. Now, I'm not trying to say that has anything to do with who he was, but they do happen to be great manipulators. Although an important thing to note from his youth is that he had an allergic reaction to a medication he took, and his family noted that he seemed different afterwards. The birth of his younger brother David when he was 7 also seemed to have a remarkable effect on the young Edward. Teddy was remarked as being notably smaller than the other kids in school, but became a loner due to his distinct high intelligence. He had a phenomenal educational career, graduating from Evergreen Park Community High School and skipping the 11th grade, getting accepted to Harvard University on a full scholarship at 16. Now, to some, being the smart would almost be a dream come true, but I believe that it was at Harvard when Kaczynski first crossed the ideas about the evils of society. These ideas then sprouted into anti-technology ideologies mixed in with other ideas for revolution. It was also at Harvard that Kaczynski began to have wild fantasies of revenge and began to dream of just escaping into the wilderness. All a cesspool of concepts that, if you haven't pieced together yet, will make a whole lot of sense later. Although on top of all that already brewing, he participated in a controversial study led by psychologist Henry Murray, where he spent 200 hours hooked to electrodes, being assaulted by insults and personal attacks. Now, after all this, he then went to graduate from Harvard with a bachelor's degree in 1962. Now at 25, he became the youngest assistant professor in the history of the University of California and taught undergraduate geometry and calculus in 1967. This is the part in his life where things start to fall apart. He found great trouble communicating with his students and became unsatisfied with his job to the point where he just abruptly resigned. He then went to work in a factory with his younger brother David, and it was there he found himself in a relationship with a supervisor. Eventually, after that came to an end, through a breakup that left him terribly bitter towards her, he was fired from the factory. Although the news of the firing was delivered to him through his brother David. After a blow like that, he followed the course of action much like any reasonable human being in his position would do and moved into a cabin he built in the middle of the woods outside of Lincoln, Montana, near where his parents had been living in 1971. He didn't have much money while living in the cabin and taught himself hunting and organic farming. This investment into his estate led him to become disturbed by how real estate and industrial development crept upon his woodland home. Then once again, as the great beacon of logic and rationality he is, he vandalized and tried to sabotage his Lincoln construction sites in order to protect the life he was living. While in the woods, he sent a lot of letters to his family, most of which were angry and resentful, and it was also by this point he started his spree of domestic terrorism. Likely with the realization of this new lifestyle, he also decided to go by new initials, FC, which stood for Fuck Computers. Not really. He made it clear it was Freedom Club. Not as metal and doesn't scream anti-industrialism nearly as well, but it still fits, I guess. Kaczynski's first known murder victim was Hugh Scruton, who owned a computer shop and was killed when the bomb detonated on him just outside the shop in 1985. He then went on to target another computer store owner, Gary Wright, who was severely injured by a bomb in Utah in 1987. On this occasion, the secretary of Gary noticed that the Unabomber himself set this bomb and recalled to the police an image of his face. In 1993, bombs were sent to both a California geneticist, Charles Epstein, and a Yale computer science professor, David Gelernter. Although Kaczynski's final murder victims were advertising executive Thomas J. Mosser in New Jersey in 1994 and a timber lobbyist Gilbert Britt Murray in California a year later. The FBI eventually concluded that 16 bombs created by Kaczynski resulted in 23 injured victims and 3 deaths. Only 2 bombs by Kaczynski were managed to be identified and defused before an explosion. Although in most cases the intended targets would find these packages only to have them detonate and fill them with various pieces of shrapnel. These bombs were relatively untraceable, and the 150 full-time investigators on the case were having the most difficult time over the course of these long, fear-filled 17 years putting together any clues which resulted in a conclusive identity. This would make the Unabomber investigation the longest and most expensive hunt for a serial killer. although the biggest lead in the case was given to the FBI by Kaczynski himself, and had he not, the question of how long he would have remained a mystery still stands. Ted, at this point now known as the Unabomber, sent the FBI a 35,000-word essay claiming to explain his motives and views on the ills of society. He claimed that if the authorities took time to understand his manifesto and published it for the world to see, he would desist from terrorism. The police figured they had nothing to lose from having it published and released it to the Washington Post and New York Times, who made it public. His essay, now titled The Unabomber's Manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, I'll speak on its contents later, but the overall result I want to point out in relation to the case was that it caused thousands to sprout forward with suspects, although one person's suspicion stood further than anyone else's, David Kaczynski, Ted's brother, who had this investigation brought to his attention by his wife. As mentioned earlier, David had received a lot of letters from Ted with the same linguistic style as the manifesto. When David brought these letters to the police, their linguistics expert said that they were almost certainly made by the same author. David gave a little bit more about his brother, and by then they had enough evidence to put out a search warrant and storm Ted's cabin. His cabin had bomb components, 40,000 handwritten journal pages with bomb experiments, and descriptions of crimes, along with one live bomb. Needless to say, guilt was evident, although his brother did work very hard to get him a plea deal that would allow him to escape the death penalty. Must have been very difficult because Ted was very adamant that he wasn't crazy and was mentally sane, although he was definitely diagnosed with schizophrenia. David and the computer store owner who survived Ted's 12th bomb, Gary, banded together to parade the country advocating against the death penalty. Ted, the unlikely benefactor of their goodwill, earned 8 life sentences in a Colorado supermax prison dubbed Alcatraz in the Rockies. There he was assigned a block nicknamed Bombers Row because it just so happened to be the place where Kaczynski met Timothy McVeigh and Ramzi Ahmed Yusuf. To provide further context, McVeigh was responsible for the Oklahoma City bombings, which remains the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in America ever. Yusuf, on the other hand, was part of Al-Qaeda's initial World Trade Center bombings, which did not succeed to topple the towers, but still left multiple casualties. All people with a common fascination for destruction and having mutual political beliefs along with overlapping philosophy. An analogy I feel that best describes their friendship was, it's like having the Wolfman and Dracula and Frankenstein all in the same wing. Said by David Herbrick, who wrote The American Terrorist, Timothy McVeigh, and the Oklahoma City bombing, with his fellow Buffalo News reporter Lou Mike. Their little hateful trio lasted until McVeigh's death in 2001 via lethal injection. Since then, not much has changed for Kaczynski, aside from a couple disputes with the government who eventually auctioned off his estate. He remains 76 today and behind bars, although echoes of his terror still speak today in light of the recent Austin bombings, which saw similarly untraceable mailed explosives. Although Kaczynski during his spree also gave people deja vu from an earlier serial killer as well, the Zodiac, who at the height of his terror claimed he would kill more people if he had not had his manifesto published. And don't get me wrong, Kaczynski was no stranger to causing terror, even claiming he had the ability to blow up a plane mid-flight. Now with all that figured out and discussed, the final piece remaining a mystery was that 35,000-word manifesto about industry. As to my understanding, as there are many, and I mean many, takeaways you can receive not only from this work, but as to the multiple works released by the Unabomber. The main pieces are hardly disputed, but it's the little parts and suggesting the policy that are left to question. The things that really only could have been determined had his dream actually come to fruition. The main takeaway and central idea from the Unabomber's manifesto is that any industrial society must inherently suppress human freedom and self-esteem. This cannot be corrected by any means and will continually worsen with time. He starts off by setting the scene to convey his thesis by essentially saying that society eliminates choice by making life's options either easier to achieve through government aid or difficult through illegal means. Those at the bottom have no real freedom as a smooth society takes it away from them. People try to use escapism or certain activities to help aid the suffering brought in total by industry, although this only perpetuates industry and feeds their suffering. Industrialization creates a strong society, not in the health sense, but more in the power sense, brings structure and guidance through basic needs. These initial points establish the theme of societal slavery that he spends the majority of his manifesto establishing, but touches on in greater detail in other projects. He believed we'd already been enslaved by our creations, much like talked about in a sci-fi novel. He then carries on to say that these trends are perpetrated by politicians as it keeps them in power and they have no want in change. This is why small gradual change cannot be made to help people. Long-term permanent solutions are the only way to actually make success because they cannot be stopped. This is a means to destroy and rebuild something else. Whatever forms after destruction will ultimately be better. This is him basically addressing the politicians and the government as evil villains and serves to burn any olive branches. Any attempts at peace or resolution are easily shut down throughout the manifesto. He clearly states that he sees no way society can improve without violence. If he dehumanizes and villainizes his opponents, he reduces any opportunity at achieving a common ground or peace, a tactic sadly frequently used in political dispute. This is mainly how he serves to justify the actions he took throughout his life. He also asserts that society is tightly wound, quoted, "Good comes with the bad." Technology cannot be prevented, but it can be delayed. The only way to remove it is by a stronger development. Cryptic, I know, but essentially he believes that society has already been ruined. Things are so complicated that there is no fixing it. Human nature does not allow the capacity to solve such an issue where things are so tightly wound together. Reform is short-term, and any reform will be limited by a number of supporters, weak in passion, and will jump ship after small amounts of change. The only time people will band together is if they feel it's in their best interest. Humans are unable to solve the environmental issue and appear unable to solve the industry issue. Complete destruction of industry is not in our best interest, though, although an overhaul via revolution to delay is, most likely the best option for us. Destruction of specifically large-scale technology is the goal, though. Society is in the midst of crisis where gangs, militias, and ghettos are running loose, where civil unrest is heavy and can be leveraged to produce a revolution. Destruction will cause suffering, but less than a continuation of society as it is. Persuasion through logic for intellectuals and emotion for others to attract a larger conglomerate and to bolster the arms for the revolution. Now, to anyone who's made it this far, it's very clear that he wants a revolution. He spends the majority of his earlier sections invalidating the possibility of reform. He also criticizes reformers and reform theory, as he truly believes it doesn't accomplish anything. He believes destruction is the only way to really begin fixing things. It sounds like a paradox, but once we remove technology, he believes the human race will be better off. Not sure how he believes this, because this would almost surely reduce our numbers astronomically. He also believes that the human race was on the brink of revolution due to crime rates at the time. He figured that it would just be easy to organize a revolution because we were one small jump from just turning on each other. His main reasoning or justification is that technology will cause more harm to the human race than the ramifications of violently destroying it. Then finally, he states that political solutions are worthless and that the revolution has to be global to work. He also says that any leftist movements must be shunned as they rely too heavily on technology and will not be able to put that along to survive. Basically just going on and supporting his idea for revolution, saying that there's no way he could have achieved global political support. It was just impossible to him. Although the idea that all humans could band together and fight for a single cause was somehow more realistic. He cared for the health of the human race and never spoke worrying himself with American problems. He also has the chapter at the end where he allows his readers to know his distaste for the leftist movement, especially as they have too much of a dependency on technology, apparently. But anyone could have inferred his political lean from earlier in the novel, so that's not much of a shock by then. That still is essentially my summary of the manifesto, paraphrasing each of the major points. I tried to remain as unbiased as I could, but when you're dealing with the beliefs of a literal domestic terrorist, it becomes extremely hard to do. Just from the aforementioned beliefs, you can see a clear libertarian lead, although somehow he attracted those from all over the political spectrum, even those he despised on the left. A main supporter of his was Keith Abloh, who was a psychiatrist by profession, who heavily condemned his actions but regarded his message as heavily important. Nonetheless, a polarizing figure to say at the least. Multiple different words can be used to describe ye old Teddy Kaczynski. Sociopathic, monster, controversial, dangerous, mysterious, but at the end of the day, the Unabomber will always be the same crazy serial bomber who proposed unrealistic but surprisingly logically based political disposition. It sucks to accept, but what if in part he had been right? Maybe those moments when our parents force away our technology, perhaps they too are proposing the returning to a hunter-gatherer era of the human race. Seriously speaking though, more than shocked to consider his opinions, but the complex nature and understanding of our existence and the future of the human race really leaves you thinking what technology actually spells out for us.